March 3rd, 1945. Crystal City Internment Camp, deep in the scrubland of South Texas. The sun was low, cutting long shadows across the dirt roads as a transport truck hissed to a stop. Inside, 32 Japanese women, stiff-backed, silent, eyes forward. They stepped down carefully, expecting the worst. A labor camp, perhaps. Cold rice, shouting guards. Shame. Instead, they saw trees, painted buildings, children laughing in the distance. And then, something strange. A voice, a girl maybe 12, walking by the fence with a stack of books. One of the women asked, "What are those for?" The guard answered casually, "School. She's going to college one day." The group paused. A few women laughed. College? For girls? Sakiko Onishi, wife of a Navy attaché, whispered to her neighbor, "Americans always joke." But that night, the laughter didn't return. Because what they heard next would break something deeper than pride. Tokyo, 1938. The women chosen for foreign service were not ordinary wives. They were symbols, pillars of the empire abroad. Sakiko Onishi was one of them. 24. Educated in etiquette and calligraphy. Trained to walk 3 steps behind her husband, never to interrupt, never to raise her eyes too long. She wore silk, even in summer. When they sailed for America, her father bowed with pride. Their mission was simple: project the image of imperial grace, unshakable hierarchy, the power of a quiet woman behind a powerful man. In San Francisco, they dined with consuls. In Washington, they toured gardens and museums. They wrote home of wide roads, noisy radios, and a people who smiled too often. But deep down, they believed what they had been taught, that America was soft, that its women, loud and unrefined, were evidence of a nation in decay. Even after Pearl Harbor, even after their arrest, that belief didn't crack. At Crystal City, the Japanese internees formed their own order. They wore white gloves. They saluted the emperor's portrait before bed. They refused to speak English, even when the guards offered lessons. Inside the women's barracks, Sakiko kept a notebook. Her entry on the first week reads, "They are kind, but too casual. The girls smile at men. They speak without waiting. A system like this cannot last." She wasn't alone. Mrs. Fujimoto, whose husband taught in Seattle, ran a small school in the camp, teaching Japanese classics to the younger children. One morning, a girl returned from the infirmary and whispered something that rippled across the room. The nurse was a woman, an American. That was the first crack. Later that month, Red Cross leaflets arrived. Japanese translations of American principles: freedom, equality, opportunity. The women scoffed. They believed it was propaganda, nothing more. But things kept surfacing. A delivery woman, a female electrician repairing wires, a teenage girl on a bicycle, with a school bag and a map. And then, the whispers grew louder. "Did you hear? They let women vote here? They don't have arranged marriages. They send daughters to college?" At first, the women dismissed it. Then they laughed. Then they fell silent. Sakiko wrote in her journal, "They build wide roads, but they lack soul." But even as she penned the words, her hand trembled. The wind in Crystal City came dry off the desert, cutting through the wire fences and rustling the laundry lines between the barracks. Sakiko stood in line at the canteen one morning, the dust catching in the folds of her kimono, when something unusual caught her eye. A young American girl, no more than 10, walking outside the fence. She wasn't with an adult. She wasn't carrying groceries or sweeping a porch. She carried a thick book. The girl stopped at the edge of the property, stared back at the women inside. She waved. Sakiko didn't wave back. Inside the barracks that evening, talk circled around that girl. A teacher? A delivery? Why was she alone? Someone said, "She goes to school nearby. I've seen her with a satchel and a ruler." The women laughed it off. But the next morning, something else happened. One of the camp's female guards, Corporal Emily Hayworth, entered the barracks for inspection. She was firm, brisk, and spoke no Japanese. But she was respected, even feared. Sakiko noticed how the male guards deferred to her, how she carried a clipboard, not a broom, how she gave orders without apology. "She's different," Mrs. Fujimoto whispered. "I've never seen a woman act like that in public." Then came the inspection at the infirmary. A Japanese nurse named Aiko, fluent in both languages, whispered as she passed Sakiko, "Did you know? That American guard. She studied law. She had a scholarship." Sakiko froze. Law? A woman? It must be a mistake. Or an American exaggeration. They exaggerate everything. Their food, their movies, their values. Back in the barracks, the women whispered late into the night. Some were skeptical, others curious. Sakiko sat by the window, watching the lights from the schoolhouse outside the wire. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. A face trained to serve, to endure. Behind her, someone murmured in the dark, "Maybe we have misunderstood them." No one answered. But no one laughed, either. April 1945. The war was still raging, but in Crystal City, the sun was warm, and the magnolias had begun to bloom. One morning, the camp director made an announcement. A small group of Japanese women, considered well-behaved and educated, would be allowed to attend a local cultural exchange at the nearby high school. Sakiko was on the list. She didn't want to go, not because she feared the Americans, but because something inside her had started to shift, and that scared her more. The group boarded a small bus. No chains, no guards with rifles. Just a quiet ride through open fields, past farms, gas stations, roadside diners. At the school, the women were led down a hallway with clean tile and the faint smell of chalk and lemon floor polish. Then the door opened, and what Sakiko saw didn't make sense. A classroom, filled with teenage girls in slacks and sweaters, laughing, raising hands, debating. On the blackboard, constitutional rights and responsibilities. At the front, a female teacher in her 30s, writing equations on the board. Sakiko felt her stomach twist. No one bowed. No one asked permission to speak. The girls debated the limits of executive power with passion. Some spoke faster than the interpreter could translate. One student, maybe 16, stood and read her essay on democracy. Sakiko didn't hear all the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Confidence, strength, not softness, not submission. Afterward, in the lunch hall, a teacher approached their group. She smiled gently and asked if any of them had gone to college. Sakiko felt her face flush. "No," she replied. The woman nodded. "Well, most girls here will. Some study engineering, some teach, some want to fly planes." "Fly?" Sakiko looked at the woman, small, unarmed, or friendly, and felt an old belief begin to tremble. On the ride back to camp, no one spoke. The Teenus wind howled outside, dry and hard. That night, Sakiko opened her journal and wrote just one line. "If a woman can read the stars, why would she ever bow?" May 1945. The war was turning. News from Europe filtered into the camp like whispers. Berlin surrounded, Hitler cornered. Silence from Tokyo growing louder. But inside Crystal City, something else was unraveling. The Red Cross delivered a set of film strips, part of a wartime morale program meant to show American values to the interned. Most of the Japanese women refused to go, but Sakiko went. The gymnasium smelled of varnish and old popcorn. A projector hummed as reels spun behind a folding screen. And then, there she was. A tall woman with a calm face and a clear voice, dressed simply, speaking directly into the camera. "I am Eleanor Roosevelt," she said, "and this is a war for the minds of free people." Sakiko blinked. The interpreter whispered, "That is the president's wife." Laughter stirred in the room. Brief, nervous. But the film didn't stop. Clips of Eleanor giving speeches, visiting factories, touring hospitals, holding wounded soldiers' hands, reading to children. She wasn't hidden. She wasn't silent. She led. And everyone around her let her. Sakiko didn't laugh. She watched, jaw tight, spine straight. The camera cut to scenes of women in flight gear. Mechanics, engineers, women pressing ammunition, women studying maps. A line of girls entering a university. The voiceover continued. In America, women help win wars, not just with strength, but with thinking. No one in the room moved. The projector clicked off. Silence. One woman muttered, "It's staged." But another said softly, "I don't think it is." That night, back in the barracks, Sakiko sat on her cot. She didn't light the lantern. She didn't write. She simply stared into the dark and whispered to herself, "If they let women lead, what else have we misunderstood?" Summer came hard to Crystal City. The air turned thick, the soil cracked under the sun, and the cicadas screamed through the nights. Inside the camp, the librarian, a wiry man from Chicago, began offering books in English to prisoners deemed low risk. Sakiko hesitated at first. Then she picked up a thin novel. The Red Pony by Steinbeck. The words were strange, the metaphors foreign. But she read it all. Then Little Women, then A History of American Suffrage. Each book cracked the shell a little more. One evening, during English class, A young Nisei interpreter, born in California, fluent in both cultures, stayed after to talk. Sakiko asked softly, "Your sister, what does she do?" The girl smiled. "She's studying architecture at Berkeley." Sakiko blinked. Architecture? A woman at university. She asked about her mother. She ran a flower shop, hired men, managed contracts, even paid for my uncle's operation. Sakiko's face remained still. But inside, the storm began. Back in the barracks, Mrs. Fujimoto showed her a magazine, Stars and Stripes, smuggled in from one of the guards. Inside, a photo of a woman in uniform, standing in front of a B-17 bomber. Caption, "Navigator, 23 years old." They stared at it like a piece of science fiction. Sakiko turned to the others. "They're not just pretending," she said. "They're becoming." A hush fell. The old rules, the sacred truths, began to taste like dust. The next day, Sakiko asked the librarian if he had any books on American law. He chuckled, but brought her a beginner's civics reader. At night, she read slowly, lips moving with every word. In one chapter, it explained, "The American citizen, male or female, holds equal rights before the law." She underlined it twice, then again, then a third time. Later that week, a new phrase began floating around the women's block. Strange at first, almost taboo. Education. Some whispered it. Others rolled it around like a foreign candy. And one night, Sakiko wrote in her journal, "We trained our daughters to obey. They trained theirs to build." August 15, 1945. The camp radio crackled with static. Then, the voice of the emperor. Faint, measured, breaking through a language that had never before known surrender. Inside the women's barracks, no one moved, no one wept. They just stopped. Sakiko sat with her hands folded on her lap. She didn't look at the others. She didn't speak. The voice faded. Silence. Outside, a trumpet sounded taps for the American flag. Inside, an empire collapsed. That night, Sakiko tore out the first page of her journal, the one where she had written, "They build wide roads, but they lack soul." She burned it in a tin cup behind the kitchen. 2 days later, Corporal Emily Hayworth entered the barracks to distribute new Red Cross packages. Sakiko looked up, held her gaze, and said, in English, "Thank you." Hayworth paused, then nodded. Word spread. The women, once so proud in their silence, began to ask for more English books, more questions, more lessons. Mrs. Fujimoto, who once enforced bowing rituals at roll call, now practiced vocabulary with a Nisei teenager, asking how to say nurse, school, and permission. One woman applied to a post-war vocational program in California. Another asked if American universities accepted foreign students. Sakiko was different now. She spoke less. But when she did, her voice no longer trembled with old superiority or shame. Instead, it carried something new. Clarity. One afternoon, she took chalk and drew on the concrete near the garden a diagram of the English alphabet. She called the younger girls to gather. "Let's begin," she said. She taught them letters, then words, then ideas. And one morning, a girl asked, "What does this mean? Opportunity?" Sakiko looked at the sky, cloudless and massive, and replied, "It means you get to try." Weeks passed. She began to teach regularly. Not just language, but questions. Why do they let women speak? Why do they trust girls with science? Why didn't we? The guards noticed. One American soldier, barely 20, wrote to his sister in Illinois. "They've changed, not just surrendered. It's like they're waking up." And Sakiko, she no longer wore silk every day. Sometimes she wore canvas, and on her desk sat 2 books, side by side, the Kojiki and the American Constitution. By late 1940, the war had ended, but the questions inside Crystal City had only begun. Sakiko stood by the library window, watching a convoy of trucks unload supplies. Uniform crates, uniform movements, uniformed men and women unloading them with practiced rhythm. Everything was efficient. Later that day, she sat with the camp director, a former logistics officer now managing re-education programs. She asked him carefully about the American system. He smiled, and then he explained. 6 million American women had entered the workforce during the war. 350,000 served in uniform. Factories in Michigan and Ohio had entire production lines operated by women, not just to replace men, but to exceed quotas. They didn't just work. They engineered. They managed. He showed her photos, black and white images of women in overalls assembling aircraft engines, driving forklifts, leading inspection teams. They didn't pause for tradition, he said. They paused for no one. Sakiko's hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. One caption read, "Female Team Lead, Red Ball Express Maintenance Unit, 1944. Another, standardized female uniforms cut production waste by 13%. It wasn't just the presence of women. It was the planning behind it, the infrastructure that supported it, a pipeline of education, training, coordination, stretching across state lines and time zones. Sakiko remembered Japan's factories, her husband's stories, horse-drawn transport, missing screws, 30 different truck models, each with incompatible parts. In contrast, America had taught its girls to work together, to solve problems, to build fast and break nothing. Later that week, an American officer gave a short talk to the female internees. He spoke slowly, so the interpreter could keep up. "Victory," he said, "was not built on luck or strength alone. It was built on systems. And our system includes everyone." Sakiko stared at him. She thought of the women she knew in Tokyo, obedient, brilliant, invisible, and she realized they'd never been allowed to try. That night, she added a new sentence to her journal. They won because they refused to waste half their minds. The old myths were fading. Sakiko once believed American women were soft, frivolous, vain, incapable of loyalty. Now, she was learning. They were the skeleton inside the machine. The librarian handed her a pamphlet titled Modular Production in Wartime America. It wasn't printed for show. It was instruction how every factory, school, and person could be part of something massive. The Ford plant in Michigan built B-24 bombers at a rate of 1 per hour. But what stunned Sakiko wasn't the numbers, it was who worked there. Over 30% were women, some with children, some fresh out of high school. They didn't just rivet, they planned, coordinated, trained new workers while managing precision to the millimeter. The system wasn't chaos, it was choreography. And behind it, a culture that assumed women could learn anything. One sentence in the pamphlet haunted her for days. When production is modular and intelligence is assumed, speed becomes limitless. She underlined it 3 times. Back in her barracks, she looked at the women around her, still practicing calligraphy, still preparing tea. But now, more of them were speaking English, reading aloud, translating newspapers from the camp's American staff. One had begun writing letters to a university on behalf of her daughter. Sakiko found herself at the front of the classroom, again, not teaching ritual, but writing the word future on the chalkboard in both languages. She paused, then added another word beneath it. Design. The next step. A new girl arrived at the camp, a Nisei from Oregon. 17, speaks 3 languages, reads maps like a cartographer. Her name was Naomi. She sat in Sakiko's class and asked innocently, "Why didn't your girls go to school in Japan?" Sakiko didn't answer right away. She just stared at the chalk in her hand, then quietly replied, "We were afraid of what they'd become." By autumn, the cicadas fell silent. Crystal City cooled under a pale sky, and the women, once so bound by silence, now spoke of strange futures, not in whispers, but in plans. Inside the library, Sakiko read a report from the War Department. She turned the pages slowly, lips moving. The numbers were impossible. The United States had built nearly 300,000 aircraft during the war, 96,000 tanks, 15 billion rounds of ammunition, more than 70,000 female officers trained across the services. And more staggering still, over 400,000 women had graduated from wartime colleges, trained in chemistry, physics, engineering, logistics. They hadn't merely replaced men. They'd pushed production beyond what any enemy could match. Sakiko thought of Japan's factories, bombed, underpowered, filled with exhausted teenagers. Thought of the women there, educated just enough to serve, never to question. In one footnote, she found a quote from a general. "We let our girls read maps. That's why we knew where to hit." It made her exhale sharply. Later that week, a visiting officer gave a presentation to the internees. His voice was calm, but the numbers hit like artillery. "We outproduced the Axis 3-1 in tanks, 4-1 in planes, 10-1 in fuel. Because our workers didn't just follow orders, they learned." He paused. "And half of them wore skirts." The room didn't laugh. They listened. Sakiko sat still, holding her notebook like a relic. The facts were no longer abstract. They were judgment. They were proof of something deeper than steel and oil. America hadn't won because its men fought harder, but because its society let women think louder. The war had been industrial, but the victory was cultural. She flipped back to the first page of her new journal, now half filled with English phrases and clipped articles. In bold strokes, she wrote, "They didn't beat us with strength. They beat us with system, with permission, with minds we never trained." That evening, a group of women wired around the schoolroom globe. Naomi spun it gently. Someone asked, "Where is Harvard?" Someone else asked, "What does scholarship mean?" Sakiko smiled faintly. She had once believed knowledge made women disloyal. Now she saw the truth. It made them dangerous. Years later, long after the wires had rusted and the uniforms faded, a photograph surfaced in a Texas archive. Black and white, blurry at the edges, but unmistakable. A woman stands at a chalkboard, writing the word future. Behind her, rows of Japanese girls, some still in uniform, some barefoot, all watching closely. The caption reads, "Crystal City Internee, English Class, 1946. Instructor, S. Onishi." No mention of the war, no mention of the empire, just a name, a woman, a new beginning. On the back of the photo, written in faded fountain pen, "She taught them to bow, then she taught them to stand." Later, immigration records show a woman named Sakiko Onishi arrived in San Francisco in 1952, naturalized in 1958, occupation, language teacher. Under highest education, she wrote one word, ongoing. In her final years, she lived in Pasadena, gardened alone, wore American canvas skirts and spoke English with clipped precision. But every year, in March, she lit a single lantern in her backyard. No prayers, just reflection. She kept 2 books by her bedside, the Kojiki and the American Constitution. A neighbor once asked her why. She smiled, looked up at the stars, and replied, "We thought we had honor, but they had blueprints." And in the final line of her last journal, found after her death, she wrote, "They taught their girls to read. That's why we never stood a chance."